Därför att det är ett sånt sällsynt vedervärdigt system. Att på grund av människors hudfärg döma dem till en mycket sämre tillvaro. Och det är en skam för världen så länge detta består.
Ja, det är mord på Sveavägen.
Det var en slakt. Och det var en slaktare. Det var en bödel som visste precis vad han ville.
Han blev inte skjuten som statsminister. Han blev skjuten som privatperson.
Polisen säger att mordet av allt att döma var mycket noga planlagt.
Och alla personer med walkie-talkies på varsin sida om Sveavägen som man hörde liksom.
Jag trodde att man i mordutredningar alltid gjorde bandade förhör med de väsentliga personerna som har funnits på platsen och som är viktiga.
Makalöst ointresse.
Det är klart att man försöker liksom suggerera sig fram till att få ihop bilderna om man nu var säker på att det var dem, så vill man ju få det att överensstämma med sitt eget vittnesmål.
När sanningen om det här kommer fram så kommer det svenska samhället att förändras i grunden.
Sydafrika, vilket jag personligen tycker är ett ganska intressant uppslag med tanke på att det är en ganska konkret motivbild. Det pratas mycket om Sydafrika och det är flera personer som har tagit kontakt med oss och haft intressanta synpunkter på det här uppslaget.
Fick Craig veta att Palme var nyckelpersonen i att ena sydafrikanska anti-apartheidrörelsen.
Det var min tanke och det har jag trott allt sedan dess.
I förra delen gick vi igenom det SIA-dokument som producerades våren 1988 för att ge en översikt över hur läget var i landet efter alla skandalerna med vapenexport från Sverige. Hur och om det överhuvudtaget hade drabbat de svenska politiska partierna. Både den sittande regeringen eller oppositionen. Som vi fick reda på var det ingen fara eftersom alla, utom det nya gröna partiet, var lika insyltade i alla dessa affärer ändå. Men det blev också tydligt att det var ett mycket överslätande dokument som inte ens gick igenom de mycket konkreta detaljerna som redan funnits i omlopp i och med artikeln i USA redan under 1987. Den fantastiska artikeln av Richard Reves. Han som var i Sverige i flera veckor och gjorde ett verkligt journalistiskt arbete. Ni minns det som sedan Ingvar Carlsson bara viftade bort. Richard som träffade högt uppsatta regeringsföreträdare som efter rekord visste precis vad som hänt och bara ville att Palmemordet skulle lösas, inte klaras upp. Vi lyfte även en artikel i österrikisk press där svenska höga företrädare kunde bekräfta att både mordet på Olof Palme och Bernt Karlsson var utfört av sydafrikanska regimen och deras agenter.
I denna del kommer vi att fördjupa oss ytterligare i omständigheterna kring Sverige och vapenhandeln i Mellanöstern, mitt under pågående konflikt. Ännu en gång, för den som inte fastnar i att förenkla saker, för att snabbt hitta en syndabock att lägga skulden på. Så undrar man ju egentligen hur det gick till när ett kallt, litet, låtsasneutralt land uppe i norr börjar ge sig in i den smutsiga världspolitiken med stora, ofta korrumperade om pengar, med våldsamma regimer och exportera vapen till olika delar av Mellanöstern. Hur hamnade Bofors i allt detta, som egentligen bara skulle tillverka vapen till det neutrala inhemska försvaret? Ännu en gång är det utländska personer som ger oss den bästa och ovinklade oförvanskade versionen av vad som ledde fram till ett rimligt händelseförlopp, till hur saker utvecklade sig genom åren. Ta bara en sådan enkel sak, som hur lärde sig iranierna att använda robot 70. Hur ombesörjde Bofors denna sak, när inte ens Iran fick köpa dessa fina vapen? Vad fick Iran alla pengar ifrån? Gjorde Sverige andra affärer med Iran? Hade de några naturtillgångar som Sverige ville ha? Ännu en gång läser vi artikeln i sin helhet, för att alla ska kunna bedöma och värdera sådant som jag eventuellt missar och plockar ut från det jag tycker är viktigt. Men kom ihåg att när det tillrättalagda sossenarrativet om hur oskuldsfull Palme var kommer, så är ni redan vaccinerade och bara kan förbi sig dessa sagor i artikeln.
Artikeln är skriven av Kenneth R. Timmerman. En person som engagerat sig mycket mot den iranska regimen och många andra aktuella ämnen. Han har stor erfarenhet av olika konflikter i Mellanöstern.
Chapter 8: Sweden's Lost Innocence. A Mysterious Death. Rumors that major Swedish armaments companies had been smuggling high-technology weaponry and ammunition to Iran for nearly 10 years erupted into a full-blown scandal on January 15, 1987, when a top-ranking military official responsible for granting arms export licenses fell mysteriously to his death in front of a Stockholm subway train. Half an hour before his death, the official, Rear Admiral Karl-Erik Algernon, received a visitor, Anders Carlberg, their Senti-appointed president of Nobel Industries AB. Carlberg was furious. A company audit he had ordered after the rumors first surfaced confirmed that for nearly 10 years a Nobel subsidiary, AB Bofors, had illegally sold weapons to Iran, Bahrain, Dubai, Libya and Oman. Carlberg had been brought into the company to wipe the slate clean. Already, he had cancelled $80 million in orders from suspect foreign clients. But now, Carlberg said, Bofors officials were telling him that Algernon had known about the smuggling from the very start. One of the loopholes in Sweden's arms export law and the one many Swedish officials believe Carlberg called to Algernon's memory on the day he died concerns prior knowledge by the government of illegal diversion. If Algernon, as chief of the Krigsmateriel Inspectorate, KMI, had known Bofors was intending to ship weapons to an illegal destination and failed to act, then Bofors could not be accused of a crime. Swedish officials are divided as to the real cause of Algernon's death. Some point to his honor as a career officer to suggest that he could never accept to become the scapegoat in the Bofors case. But co-workers who saw Algernon earlier that day say categorically he did not commit suicide. The Swedish government has suggested that Algernon was negligent and that he simply failed to suspect foul play. However, before taking over the War Material Inspectorate job, Algernon headed Swedish military intelligence, not a position for a blue-eyed innocent. He fell to his death 6 days before he was scheduled to give evidence on Bofors to the police. Adding to the malaise created by yet another unsolved murder after the Palme assassination of February 28, 1986 was the sudden, unexplained retraction of 2 eyewitnesses. Initially, they told the police they had seen someone push Algernon onto the subway tracks. 2 days later, they said they may have been mistaken. Algernon's death set off a political crisis in Sweden that was the closest any European country came to Irangate. The usually cautious Swedish media pressed the case. 3 official investigations came to a head, and every day brought its share of new revelations. The crux of the matter was a series of questions similar to those of the Irangate investigations in Washington. Who in the government knew of the illegal arms exports? When did they find out? And what, if anything, did they do to stop them? The Singapore connection. Sweden has the false reputation of having some of the toughest arms export control laws in the world. In fact, just the opposite is the case. Swedish law, for instance, leaves the door wide open for defense companies to market their weapons abroad without government approval, an activity outlawed in even such an immoral country as France. Worse, from the point of view of keeping arms exports under control, Swedish companies may even sign contracts with foreign governments and accept down payments before informing the War Material Inspectorate or applying for export licenses. This is precisely what happened with Bahrain and Iran. Martin Ardbo, who was forced to resign as Bofors president in March 1987 for his involvement in the illegal deals, says it all began in 1978. After years of trying, he finally pulled off his first Middle Eastern sale. He was especially pleased because the country Bahrain was light years removed from the Arab-Israeli conflict, and therefore should make it through the KMI. He desperately needed to expand export sales because the Swedish government had cut off development funds for the RBS-70 missile a few years back, leaving Bofors to pick up the tab. But when Ardbo applied for the export license, the government turned it down. Although Bahrain was not at war, it still belonged to a zone of conflict. So Ardbo paid a visit to Algernon's predecessor as War Material Inspector, Bengt Rosenius, to discuss how we could solve the problem of the government's refusal. Faced with the fait accompli of the Bahrain contract default, on which would have damaged Bofors' reputation as a reliable partner in other parts of the world, Ardbo says Rosenius agreed to play ball. Bofors should make it look as if the missiles were really going to a legal purchaser in Singapore. Rosenius would get a new export license approved, and the missiles would be shipped. Once in Singapore, they could be quietly re-exported. The same process, citing Unicorn International and Singapore as the legal purchaser of the equipment, was used again and again for Forum's exports whose real destination was Bahrain, Dubai, Oman, Libya and especially Iran. A long history of suspicion. Successive Swedish governments had suspected Bofors of foul play for years, but failed to turn up enough evidence for a crackdown. In November 1980, reports in defense magazines alleged that 304 RBS-70 missiles had reached Dubai and Bahrain. Then Minister of Foreign Trade, Staffan Burenstam Linder, went to Bofors headquarters to audit the company's books. When he found all the proper export licenses and shipping documents made out for Singapore, he dropped the affair. Shortly after elections returned Olof Palme to power, information surfaced that Bofors was trying to sell explosives to Libya through Yugoslavia. So just before Christmas 1981, the new War Material Inspector, Rear Admiral Algernon, was sent to Karlskoga with a lawyer. Ardbo agreed to sign an affidavit disclaiming any illegal activity, and the matter was dropped. It was a lie, Ardbo now admits. We had to protect Rosenius. Evidence of foul play mounted as the months went by, and still the Swedish government stood by or conspired to hide the truth from the public eye. In May 1984, a disgruntled Bofors employee quit the company and turned over a suitcase crammed with documents to researchers at the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society, SPAS. The new evidence documented at least other 5 illegal deals. In October 1984, Swedish Customs launched its investigation into the munitions cartel, in which Bofors played a major role. Public prosecutor Stig L. Age announced in August 1985 that Bofors weapons exported to Singapore had been diverted to Bahrain and Dubai. Dubai was a well-known transshipment point for re-export to Iran. Bofors director, Claes-Ulrik Winberg, was forced to resign his position as head of Sweden's Business Association, and later from Bofors. Arms deliveries to Singapore were suspended for 3 months. In December 1985, Swedish Customs intercepted a 26-ton shipload of Nobel gunpowder en route to Rostock, East Germany, where it was to be packed into munitions for Iran. The government knew about the illegal deliveries in the spring of 1985 at the latest, Swedish Customs officials said. The real question is, did the government stop Swedish weapons from reaching Iran or not? The evidence indicates that they did not. A special parliamentary commission investigated the question of government involvement for 5 months, but claiming it lacked documentary evidence, abandoned the effort in May 1987. Vice Chairman Anders Björk explained, Rosenius is dead. Algernon is dead. Palme is dead. Our investigation has been hampered by these deaths. Now we may never know the truth. A dangerous customer. Gunners from Bahrain were trained in Sweden on the RBS-70 in 1983. Iranian artillerymen went through Bofors training courses in Karlskoga in 1985. It is rather curious they were there, said one member of the parliamentary commission. This was apparently a marketing effort. The company clearly wanted to export. The Bofors RBS-70, Rayrider, is one of the best anti-aircraft missiles on the market today. 2 men operate the launcher, which can be man-carried or mounted on vehicles such as jeeps or armored personnel carriers. Its mobility allows it to be brought up right to the front lines, where it can fire at targets within a 5 km radius, and up to 3 km high. As of June 1985, Ardbo said it had entered operational service in 8 countries, including Singapore, where it was mounted on a British armored vehicle. And Bofors was certainly hoping for more. It's as good as the Stinger, at half the cost, Ardbo boasted. Arms experts were skeptical about the price, which they estimated at an expensive $41,500 per missile. But price was no object for Iran. In the spring 1985, an Iranian military delegation traveled to Karlskoga and bought 400 RBS-70 missile and 10 launchers for $58 million. That's about 5 times the normal price, says SPA's researcher, Hendrik Westender. Half of the shipment reached Iran in July 1985. Bofors had traded with Iran semi-legally in the early 1970s. Its old anti-aircraft guns, ammunition, and explosives to the Shah in 1973-75, and shortly before 1978 completed work on a dual-use fertilizer and explosives factory in Isfahan. The Iraqis destroyed the munitions plant early in the war, and Swedish officials said it would take a year to rebuild. The first confirmed appearance of the RBS-70 on the battlefields of the Gulf occurred during the January-February offensives in 1987. U.S. officials and European intelligence sources said the Swedish missile was responsible for a good portion of the 42 to 45 aircraft the Iraqis lost on ground support and attack missions in the east of Basra region. Iran integrated the Swedish missile into a revamped air defense network and deployed it with frontline units, where the Iraqis were least expecting it. The RBS-70 was a medium-range missile that filled the gap between Iran's long-range American-built Hawks and the shoulder-fired SAM-7s it bought from China. The Iranians liked the Swedish missile, and they wanted more. Iranian revenge? And this is where the Swedish saga takes a dark twist. According to the New York Times, Prime Minister Olof Palme was angered by the Bofors sales and blocked shipment of the additional 200 RBS-70 missiles the Iranians had ordered. Subsequent reports said he called back 2 ships carrying Bofors howitzers on their way to Iran in November 1985, one off St. Helena's Island and the other off the coast of Mozambique. On February 4, 1986, an Iranian commercial delegation arrived in Stockholm to discuss bilateral trade issues. According to some reports, the Iranians also came to collect their missiles. A Bofors spokesman later admitted that the company was under pressure from Iran. The missiles were never delivered, and 24 days later, Palme was murdered. The French news weekly L'Express believes that as the 7th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution approached in February, the order was given to punish Palme for having broken his word. It wouldn't be the first time Iran had been accused of murdering top-ranking European officials who stood in the way of its arms procurement effort. In July 1985, one of Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky's top advisors, Herbert Army, collapsed unexpectedly at a Viennese cocktail party and died on the spot. Some believed the army was poisoned for having discovered that Iran was trying to buy GH Naricum howitzers from the Austrian firm Naricum, and attempting to block the sale. A similar assassination occurred in France in January 1985. The head of the Arms Export Directorate, General René Audrin, was gunned down in front of his house in the Paris suburbs after having refused to approve French arms sales to Iran. French intelligence sources said that Audrin had been sent to Tehran 3 times on official mission in 1984 to discuss arms sales with Revolutionary Guards leader, Mohsen Rafik Daoust. When the Iranian requests were turned down, Daoust decided to make Audrin pay. Palme's secret diplomacy. Palme had long been engaged in complex diplomatic initiatives toward Iran, to establish ties with the new leadership and help them win international recognition for their revolution. Almost immediately after the fall of the Shah in 1979, Palme began courting the mullahs. Before he returned to power in 1982, he headed a team of UN mediators attempting to bring the Gulf War to a halt. Between 1980 to 1982, he visited Iran 5 times. During these trips he forged close personal ties with Iran's new leaders, Swedish officials said. Soon after he returned to power, Palme concluded a large-scale oil deal with Iran, despite Sweden's historic shift away from its traditional Middle East suppliers in favor of North Sea oil. Trade officials said the Iranians urged the deal on Palme in 1983 as a means of balancing trade between the two countries. And although adverse publicity eventually killed that particular oil deal, trade figures showed that Sweden concluded other deals for Iranian oil worth $176 million over the next 3 years, at a time when oil imports from all other Middle Eastern suppliers had dropped to zero. The oil deals were significant because they were politically motivated. And despite Palme's stated attitude of neutrality toward both belligerents in the Gulf War, no similar gesture was made toward Iraq. Indeed, Swedish oil purchases from Iraq over the same 3-year period were a mere $5.75 million. Meanwhile, Iran became a major market for Swedish products, with civilian exports to Iran topping the $500 million mark in 1984. Our foreign policy and Palme's good name helped establish this disproportionately large Iranian trade, a trade official said. It was a secret to none that Palme saw himself as an international statesman, perhaps the only one capable of bringing the endless butchery of the Gulf War to a halt. It is also clear he used trade incentives to woo the Iranian leadership into taking his advice. Government investigators who had reviewed more than 7,000 pages of documents on the smuggling cases said that Palme knew about other arms deliveries to Iran, and did nothing to stop them. It would appear Palme carried his secrets to the grave. The sacred principle. The Swedes see themselves as one of the last rightful purveyors of morality in the modern world. Sweden sparked the European groundswell against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the early 1970s, and was the first arms producer in the world to voluntarily restrict her own arms exports. Swedes find it inconceivable that their politicians might lie. Even in official circles, distrust is an uncommon phenomenon. The facts now emerging from the Bofors case have gone a long way toward shattering this public image, profoundly shaking Sweden's faith in herself. All the while they were proclaiming their moral ascendancy, Swedish businessmen and officials did not hesitate to bend the rules they themselves had made. Exactly how many RBS-70 missiles made their way to Iran remains unclear. In addition to the 200 missiles sold to Iran in 1985, Sweden's foreign minister told Parliament in March 1987 that 714 RBS-70 missiles had been delivered to the Unicorn International Trading Company in Singapore, and many were subsequently re-exported. Carl Johan Aberg, who was Undersecretary for Foreign Trade Overseas Arms Exports, noted that companies such as Bofors can skirt the entire regulatory process and sell weapons anywhere in the world through subsidiaries and licensees abroad. And we have no control over that. By 1983, when the practice was stopped, Bofors had granted production licenses to companies in 16 different countries. Some of the most energetic supporters of Swedish arms sales were in the trade unions and in the Social Democratic Party. The reason? Bofors and other major defense contractors exported more than 50% of all the weapons they produced. Jobs were more important than morals. Olof Palme himself was probably the most effective arms salesman of all. He single-handedly convinced Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1986 to buy Bofors field howitzers worth $1.3 billion, Sweden's single largest arms export order ever. A year later, Swedish radio discovered bank documents that showed how it was done, by paying bribes of more than 200 million kronor into the numbered Swiss bank accounts of top Indian officials. These revelations in May 1986 dealt yet another blow to Swedish innocence, by unveiling the dirty underside of public morality. Today many Swedes have begun to take a harder look at the whole dynamic of arms sales, and of how they might affect Sweden's role in the world. One thing that has emerged from the Bofors affair is the close linkage between arms exports and Swedish neutrality, held up as a sacred principle by Swedes on left and right alike. Palme and others realized that for Sweden to remain neutral it vitally needed a healthy arms industry. And to maintain production runs, and make the cost of national defense to the Swedish taxpayer acceptable, the political price was weapons exports. The big plus from foreign sales, a SIPRI researcher said, is that they keep production lines open free of charge. Without the Iranian and other black market orders, the Swedish government would have to increase its own orders or begin buying many of its own weapons abroad. And that would definitely have a negative effect on Swedish neutrality. Some politicians feel it would be less hypocritical to abandon arms export restrictions. Swedes must understand that countries are buying weapons to use them, not to keep them on the shelf, said Anders Björk. But the Social Democratic government of Ingvar Carlsson preferred to maintain the pretense of Swedish morality, and announced token changes in the arms export laws in April 1987. With Palme's assassination, the mysterious death of War Material Inspector Algernon, and that of his predecessor, the truth about Swedish arms deliveries to Iran may never be known. However, one thing is certain, the Bofors affair marks the end of the Palme myth. Sweden has irrevocably lost her innocence.
Jag tror verkligen att de flesta som följt denna serie kan plocka ut vad för information som är relevant i detta. Har ni hört att Palme förmodligen var en av världens största vapenhandlare? Riktigt smutsiga upplägg som befolkningen inte fick reda på. Man kan höra hur de motiverade hela med att Sverige skulle kunna vara neutrala och inte köpa vapen av andra. Men även det är lögner, eftersom vi vet att i hemlighet var Sverige redan den 17:e NATO-medlemmen. Det var viktigare att utåt sett vara den moraliska stormakten som vi blivit matade med i propagandan sedan länge. Det blir också nu tydligare att det var i olja som Sverige fick betalt. Hur skulle annars dessa länder ha råd att betala för dyra vapen? Hur oppositionen i Sverige kallt konstaterade att de som nu visste något var döda och därför bara lägger locket på. Hur sorgligt hanterat är allt detta som billiga offer i svenska vapensmugglingar. Man kan verkligen fundera på vad den svenska oskulden i och med Palmemordet egentligen handlade om. Att någon skulle vilja ha ihjäl en svensk demokratisk vald statsminister eller göra sig av med en av världens smutsigaste vapensmugglare och hycklande låtsasvärldsförbättrare som fick hibernning i dubbelspelet i världspolitiken under kalla krigets dagar. Kan man till och med tycka att det var rätt åt honom? Ta verkligen med er delar av detta in i vad vi senare kommer att försöka att summera ihop. Som ett ytterligare brev på posten så kan vi till och med via Kenneth bekräfta delar av Arnolds beskrivning av hur båtar från Sverige användes av Iran i Persiska golfen. Nämligen uppgifter från tillverkaren själv. Allt för att verkligen bekräfta uppgifter från Arnold, om någon nu överhuvudtaget skulle ha tvivlat på dessa.
Swedish scandals. In one of the ironies which has come to mark the Gulf War, high-speed patrol boats sold to Iran by neutral Sweden were used on May 6, 1987, to attack a Soviet freighter near the Straits of Hormuz. They were used again on June 27 to attack a pair of Scandinavian tankers off the coast of Kuwait. 30 of these 13-meter boats, which some press reports mistakenly called cabin cruisers, were sold to Iran by Sweden in 1984, U.S. officials said. Equipped with two 300 HP Volvo Penta engines, the boats can develop speeds up to 45 knots. Despite U.S. and Iraqi protests, the Lidingö shipyard on the outskirts of Stockholm delivered the first boats to Iran early in 1985. Lidingö owner, Anders Bagamars, said he had applied for an arms export license, but was told to his surprise by the Swedish government that the boats could be exported as civilian equipment, despite the 12.7mm machine gun mounted on board. These Swedish ships became the backbone of the newly created Revolutionary Guards Navy, based Bandar Abbas and on Iran's Farsiya island. And the guards liked them so much, they soon ordered 32 more. Their standard tactic was to use these small, fast boats to sneak up on freighters suspected of hauling arms to Iraq, and open fire with RPG-7 bazookas hand-carried by Revolutionary Guards on board. U.S. officials said that of the 50 boats eventually delivered to Iran by September 1987, only 20 were still operating. In late 1986 and early 1987, evidence began to emerge that Iran had become one of Sweden's major arms customers, and that government officials had joined forces with arms merchants in a complicity of silence to break Swedish arms export laws and defy parliamentary controls. Swedish law forbids arms exports to countries at war or to zones of conflict, a sweeping category understood to include the entire Middle East. Since 1978, however, and perhaps even earlier, the largest Swedish arms exporters have used fake end-use certificates and falsified shipping documents to circumvent Swedish law. And they claim they did so with the explicit approval of the Krigsmaterielinspektorat, or KMI, the government office responsible for granting arms export licenses. The most common procedure used by Bofors and Nobel Industries AB was to falsify their order books, listing sales of artillery munitions, 40mm naval guns, 155mm field howitzers, and at least 714 RBS-70 laser-guided anti-aircraft missiles to Singapore, a perfectly legal weapons purchaser. Singapore then re-exported the vast majority of these weapons to Iran and to other blacklisted countries through their state-owned trading company, Unicorn International. So extensive did this practice become that by 1984 Singapore ranked as the third largest buyer of Swedish weapons, according to Swedish Foreign Trade Ministry statistics. By 1985, Singapore was number 2 and was purchasing 14.4% of all Swedish arms exports. And other Swedish firms are currently under investigation for additional violations. The sheer volume of these illicit weapons sales gives credence to accusations by former Bofors executives that they had come to a gentleman's agreement with their government overseers to skirt the law, as long as they kept up appearances to please the left wing of the Social Democrat Party. The reason? If we export less, said Nobel President Anders Carlberg, then defense equipment will be more expensive for Sweden. It's as simple as that. As public scrutiny increased, the Bofors/Nobel Group was forced to cancel 400 million SK, $80 million, of export orders, while, at least a couple, of other deals, could be on the border of legality. Carlberg said. Carlberg also admitted that beyond these deals, an internal Bofors investigation had uncovered more than 10 cases where arms shipments to blacklisted countries had been disguised in the company's order books as legal exports to Austria, Singapore, and Italy. Former Bofors marketing director Martin Ardbo was more candid. We thought we lived under a system of double morality. They, the government and the KMI, wanted us to do it like this. The fallout from the Bofors scandal was so intense that it shook the moral foundations and the political assumptions on which Swedish society was based. We shall treat these aspects of the Swedish scandals in a separate chapter. An international cartel. Neutral Sweden's involvement in the black market arms trade to Iran was not limited to Bofors. Indeed, one of Iran's most capable arms procurement agents, Karl-Erik Schmitz, masterminded arms deals for Iran worth an estimated $600 million from his base in the Swedish port of Malmö, where he ran Scandinavia Commodities Corporation. Schmitz had conducted business with the Shah for more than 20 years by the time Iranian Defense Ministry officials turned to him for help in 1983. Swedish investigators, who interrogated Schmitz at length, agreed that he seemed an unlikely figure to be running a sophisticated black market arms operation. He was handsome, a family man, extremely polite, they said. Certainly not the type of person you would imagine dealing in weapons. When asked whether he had any regrets on selling arms used in the Gulf War, Schmitz replied blandly, "The powder factories must be kept going. What else would the workers do?" But Schmitz could also be cunning and extremely cynical. And according to Swedish investigators, he used every trick in the black marketeer's book. To help his Danish freighters loaded with gunpowder avoid the scrutiny of the Egyptian authorities while passing through the Suez Canal, he produced fake documents showing they were destined for Kenya. He sold gunpowder from Sweden, Holland, and West Germany to Yugoslavia, then bought it back and resold it to Iran. He faked end-use certificates to Pakistan and bills of lading. He sent gunpowder across national borders to be packed into bullets, bombs, and weapons like that. So all trace of its origin was lost. One of Schmitz's munitions deals, for which the author saw pro forma invoices and other documents, was worth a whopping $150 million. And Schmitz was involved in dozens of deals. He was a world-class operator. To satisfy Iran's enormous needs in artillery ammunition, Schmitz first turned to South Africa, whose munitions plants supplied him with the equivalent of 3,700 tons of gunpowder. But in June 1984, the South Africans cut off supplies without explanation. In fact, the state-owned Armaments Corporation had just signed a top-secret $520 million contract to supply Iraq with long-range artillery pieces. One of the Iraqi conditions was that South Africa stop deliveries to Iran. To make up the shortfall, Schmitz appealed to a little-known cartel of European munitions producers, which had grown out of a seemingly innocent trade organization set up in Brussels in 1975 called the European Association for the Study of Safety Problems in the Production of Propellant Powder, ESSP. According to an ESSP representative in Paris, the group was intended as a forum to share information on safety problems in chemical plants and on international customs and transportation regulations. With the Gulf War broke out, the association became a convenient cover for a cartel whose sole purpose soon became supplying both Iran and Iraq with munitions. Of the more than 50 original members, by 1981 only 13 companies remained. But they were among Europe's largest producers of military gunpowder and included Nobel Chemi in Sweden, PRB in Belgium, SNP in France, Nobel Explosives of Scotland, Muiden Chemi in Holland, Forset and Camera in Finland, Rio Tinto in Italy, SNIA BPD in Italy, Vinnies in Switzerland, and Vass AG in West Germany. Cartel members in Sweden, France, Holland and Belgium would meet regularly to eat and drink together and plan how they would keep Iran and Iraq supplied with munitions. Swedish customs officials explained. They knew that no single company could produce enough gunpowder to meet the enormous demand, without raising production quotas and attracting attention. So they decided to spread the work around. And that was how it worked. During those long business lunches in Paris, Madrid, Geneva, and Bruges, cartel members would sit down and portion out the monthly gunpowder needs of Iran and Iraq. 10% might go to a firm in Sweden, 20% to France, another 10% each to Holland, Finland, and Belgium. And Schmitz would sit in the middle with his fingers on the Iranian bank accounts. Western intelligence specialists estimate that during the months of intensive fighting, Iraq and Iran consumed nearly 500,000 heavy artillery shells each. That's more than 10 times the yearly consumption of most major European armies. Swedish deliveries alone sometimes amounted to 400 tons per year, or half of Sweden's yearly production of military explosives. The cartel was first cracked in November 1984, when Swedish customs raided the headquarters of Nobel Chemi after getting wind of a suspicious gunpowder shipment that had crisscrossed West Germany on its way to Syria the month before. We saw found of correspondence between Nobel and Iran. One investigator said, "So we made another raid and discovered a real mess." The cartel was next surprised in action in December 1985, when Swedish customs intercepted a 26-ton shipment of Nobel Chemi gunpowder en route from the port of Trelleborg to East Germany, where it was to be packed into munitions by the IMIS company before leaving Rostock directly for Iran. But the customs investigators were not empowered to stop cartel agent, Karl-Erik Schmitz, from engaging in black market arms smuggling. Indeed, once they quietly put a stop to Swedish gunpowder deliveries to Iran in 1986. Schmitz went to every corner of Europe and elsewhere desperately seeking new suppliers. Officials said. He went to Holland, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Greece, and especially to Israel. He had to continue these deals to avoid financial ruin, because he had posted performance bonds for 5 to 10% of the total value of his contracts. Schmitz himself remained unperturbed by the customs investigation, even though he could face criminal prosecution. After all, Schmitz said in 1987, "There are so many things you can sell the Iranians." To Richard Fairbanks, the Gunpowder Club sounded like something out of a novel. Unfortunately, for the more than 1 million dead on both sides of the front, the 13 munitions manufacturers who formed the cartel were real, and their primary mission was to fan the flames of the Gulf War.
Som ni hörde stämde det mesta med båtarna som Arnold berättade om. Handel med Iran verkar vara något som Sverige hållit på med under en längre period, och när det blivit problem har man hittat nya vägar. Det tyder också på att Sverige gjorde stora vinster med att köpa olja från Iran, vilket också förklarar mycket av var Iran får sina pengar ifrån. Men en viktig poäng är att det var den tidigare krigsmaterielinspektören som tipsade om hur Sverige skulle kunna komma runt reglerna för att kunna skeppa vapen utomlands till krigförande nationer. Så fruktansvärt skenheligt, när man samtidigt ska slå sig för bröstet moraliskt om att ha restriktiva exportrestriktioner. Även om det fortfarande finns osäkerheter i hur många vapen och när de har skeppats till Iran, vilket vi kommer att resonera mer kring framöver, så är det nästan sjukligt hur länge det här pågick. Att det till och med kan ha varit Palmes fredsmäklande i Iran-Irak-konflikten som var bakgrunden till att smugglingsaffärerna började och kunde fortgå. Det är nästan sjukligt att det fanns så många länder som till och med på ett kartellliknande sätt delade upp marknaden, eftersom det fanns så mycket ammunition att leverera till konflikten. Det är därför som det är så svårt att hantera vapenaffärer mellan länder. Det går helt enkelt inte att ta ställning och samtidigt ge sig in i en mycket farlig, vansklig och smutsig topphemlig värld. Där Sverige blir indragna i säkerhetsmässiga konflikter utan befolkningens vetskap. Hoppas verkligen att denna era är över för svensk del, en gång för alla.
Men just nu är det mer aktuellt än någonsin igen, när det ska skänkas vapen till Ukraina, som det till och med verkar finnas en osäkerhet om vad de egentligen tar vägen. Används dem, eller säljs de vidare? Utsätter inte det här Sverige för säkerhetsrisker för befolkningen, eller är det så att det bara är ett spel i en krigshetsande rysskrämmande propaganda för att Sverige ska bli en stor exportör av vapen till EU och världen i framtiden? Det är en cynisk och mycket smutsig värld vi lever i och har levt i länge. Vi får väl just nu sätta vårt hopp till en nyligen vald fredsönskande president i USA. Det är som man verkligen skäms för att vara svensk just nu.